The evening light over the Seo estate fell like hammered gold, warm enough to make the limestone walls glow and the trimmed hedges look like something out of a painting, the kind of painting that hides a body behind the frame. And somewhere beneath the chassis of a black S-Class Mercedes sitting in that sun-drenched driveway, a mercury-tilt device was waiting. Patient. Still. Counting on no one checking beneath a car that had never, in 7 years, been touched by anything but polish. Seo Do-yun was 41 years old. Head of the Cheongpa Syndicate's southern operations. A man whose signature on a single document had moved more money than most governments, and whose silence in a room was louder than other men's threats. He wore a $5,000 Italian suit the way other men wear armor, not to impress, but to remind. His neck carried a tattoo that his lieutenants had memorized the way children memorize a parent's face, with a mixture of love and fear. He had built an empire on one unbreakable principle: sentiment is a door, and every door is a weakness. So he had sealed all of his. For good. He trusted no one completely. He doubted everyone strategically. And yet, as he stepped out of his limestone fortress that Tuesday evening, flanked by 4 men in dark suits who looked like statues carved from threat, not one of them had thought to look under the car. Vesperine had been invisible in that house for 3 years. Not invisible the way ghosts are, not frightening, not felt. Invisible the way furniture is. The way the marble floors were invisible. The way the crystal decanters on the sideboard were invisible. She was 29 years old, a woman with a sharp mind behind careful eyes, who had learned early that in houses like this one, the safest thing a maid could be was unseen. She polished the same surfaces. She pressed the same linens. She walked the same corridors at the same hours, and not one of the 15 men on Do-yun's payroll had ever looked at her long enough to register her face. That was fine. That was survival. She had a younger brother in university and a mother with medical bills, and this job, this suffocating, silent, dangerous job in the most controlled household in the city, paid 3 times what anything else would. So Vesperine kept her eyes down and her ears open. And she learned things. Not because she was looking for them. But because when you are furniture, people speak freely around you. That afternoon, in the narrow pantry between the east kitchen and the service corridor, she heard 2 voices she recognized, one belonging to Lieutenant Park Jae-won, Do-yun's third-in-command and the man responsible for vehicle logistics, the other a lower voice she had heard before but couldn't yet place. They were not arguing. They were calm. And that calmness was what made the words feel like ice water sliding down the back of her neck. Mercury-tilt. Under the rear axle. He opens the door, the angle shifts, it's done. Before the summit. Before the summit. She didn't breathe. She didn't move. She stood with a tray of polished glasses against her chest and she waited until the voices disappeared down the corridor. Then she set the tray down with both hands shaking, and she made the only decision she had never planned to make in this house, the decision to be seen. If this story already has your heart rate up, hit like right now to support the channel. Subscribe to Mafia Moonlight Tales for gripping new episodes every single day. Share this with someone who loves slow burn suspense and dark loyalty twists. And drop a comment below, do you think Do-yun will trust her, or see her as a threat? Now. Let's go back to that driveway. Because Vesperine is already running. Her shoes hit the cobblestone like a second heartbeat, sharp, desperate, uneven. The evening air was warm but her skin was cold, the kind of cold that comes not from weather but from the body pulling blood inward, bracing. She could see him from 20 meters away. The width of his shoulders. The unhurried certainty in the way he moved. The 4 men flanking him who had never once failed to intimidate, and who were failing right now, without knowing it, at the one job that actually mattered. His hand was already reaching. Fingers extended toward the silver door handle of the black Mercedes, and the red light she had not seen but somehow knew was blinking beneath the chassis like a heartbeat counting down. She did not think about protocol. She did not think about the unspoken rule, the one every person in that household understood without being told: never cause a scene. Never raise your voice. Never, under any circumstance, insert yourself into the boss's world. She thought about the 2 voices in the pantry. She thought about the calm in them. And she opened her mouth. Step away from the car. The sound cracked across the courtyard like a whip. Do-yun's hand stopped. Not because he was afraid. Seo Do-yun had not been afraid of a sound since he was 19 years old. His hand stopped because in 41 years of being the most dangerous man in any room he entered, no one, not a lieutenant, not a rival, not a government official, had ever spoken to him in that register. That human register. The one that bypasses hierarchy and rank and lands somewhere older, somewhere animal. The sound of someone with nothing left to calculate. Every head in the driveway turned. The four men in suits reached inside their jackets. And Vesperine stood in the center of the cobblestone, apron still tied at her waist, arm outstretched, finger pointed at the undercarriage of the car, where a tiny red light pulsed in the golden evening light like a second, slower heart, and she held Do-yun's gaze for the first time in 3 years. Not with defiance. Not with fear. With something that took him a long moment to name, because it was a thing he had deliberately removed from his own vocabulary. She was looking at him with desperation and hope. As if she had run not to expose a bomb, but to keep something alive that she hadn't yet realized she cared about losing. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And Seo Do-yun, a man who trusted no one, who had sealed every door, who believed that sentiment was a fatal weakness, slowly lowered his hand, and looked down. The red light blinked back at him. His security had missed it. His lieutenants had missed it. And the woman he had walked past for 3 years without meeting her eyes, had not. 3 hours before her shoes hit the cobblestone, Vesperine was on her knees. Not in prayer. In the East Library, working a soft cloth in slow circles along the baseboard molding where dust collected in the carved grooves, the kind of detail that no one ever checked and everyone would notice if neglected. That was the nature of her work. Invisible effort producing invisible results, sustained by the quiet discipline of a woman who had learned that in a house like this one, perfection was the only protection. The library smelled of cedar and old paper and something faintly metallic, the particular coldness of a room that held power the way stone holds temperature. Long after the men left, it stayed in the air. She had cleaned this room 400 times. She knew the weight of its silence. She did not hear them come in. That was the thing about being furniture, people didn't announce themselves to a chair. The door opened behind her and 2 sets of footsteps crossed the hardwood with the easy confidence of men who owned the floor they walked on, and Vesperine simply continued her circles, cloth moving, head low, breath steady. Present and absent at the same time. She recognized the shoes before she recognized the voices. Lieutenant Park Jae-won's Oxfords, Italian, two-toned, the left one with a small scratch near the toe cap she had noticed months ago. The other pair she placed a half-second later. Heavier sole. A slight drag on the right foot. One of the newer men. Someone who had been at the estate less than 4 months. They didn't look at her. They never did. They moved to the far end of the library, near the tall window that overlooked the east garden, and they spoke the way men speak when they believe they are alone, not loudly, but without architecture. Without the careful construction people put around words when they know they're being heard. It has to be Tuesday. He never changes the Tuesday route. And the device. Already placed. Mercury-tilt, under the rear axle. The moment he pulls the handle and the door swings open, the angle shifts. It arms on the tilt and detonates on the close. A pause. The kind that meant the other man was running the sequence in his head, checking for cracks. Clean. Clean. Nothing to trace back. Looks mechanical. Looks like a fault. Good. Before the summit, then. Before the summit. She did not breathe. The cloth had stopped moving, but she kept her hand pressed against the baseboard as though stillness itself was a sound she had to suppress. Her pulse was enormous and everywhere, in her throat, behind her eyes, in the tips of her fingers still resting against cold wood. She heard one of them set something down on the reading table. She heard them leave. The door clicked shut. And Vesperine stayed on her knees for a long moment, in the cedar and metal silence of the East Library, holding a secret that was already trying to burn through her hands. He did not move for 3 full seconds. That was notable. In 11 years of running the Cheongpa Syndicate southern operations, Seo Do-yun had never needed 3 seconds to make a decision. His mind worked the way a blade works, immediate, clean, without hesitation. His lieutenants had built entire careers around anticipating the speed of him. And yet here he stood, hand suspended inches from the door handle of his own car, caught in place by the voice of a woman whose name he did not know. The 4 men in suits had drawn inward like a closing fist, hands at their jackets, eyes sweeping the tree line, the gate, the roof line, every trained instinct pointing outward. Toward the perimeter. Toward the obvious threat. Not one of them was looking at the car. Do-yun was. His eyes had dropped the moment hers pointed, not because he trusted her, but because something in the frequency of her voice had bypassed trust entirely and spoken directly to the part of him that had survived this long by listening to things he couldn't yet explain. He looked at the undercarriage. And there it was. Small. Deliberate. A red light blinking with the calm patience of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The cold that moved through him was not fear. It was recognition. He straightened slowly. The movement was controlled, unhurried, the way a man moves when he refuses to let his body announce what his mind has just understood. He turned to look at her fully, perhaps for the first time, and Vesperine held her ground in the center of the driveway with her arms still outstretched and her chest still heaving from the run, and she did not look away. Most people looked away from Do-yun. It was a reflex, like pulling a hand from heat. She did not. What he saw in her face was not what he expected. He had expected panic. He had expected the wild, unfocused desperation of someone who had stumbled into something too large and been broken open by it. What he saw instead was a woman who was absolutely terrified and absolutely resolved at the same time, 2 things he had believed could not occupy the same face. Her eyes were dark and direct and full of something that took him a long, uncomfortable moment to name, because it was a thing that belonged to a world he had locked the door on a very long time ago. She was looking at him like he was worth saving. Not the empire. Not the syndicate. Not the network of fear and money and controlled silence that he had spent his adult life constructing. Him. As if underneath the $5,000 suit and the tattoo and the reputation that made grown men lower their voices, there was simply a person standing next to a car, and she had run to reach him before the car did. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he spoke, quietly, to no one in particular. Clear the driveway. Nobody touches the vehicle. A breath. Bring her inside. The bomb disposal team arrived in an unmarked van 40 minutes later. Do-yun watched from the window of his study, 2nd floor, northeast corner, the only room in the estate where the glass was thick enough to stop a rifle round. He watched them crouch beneath the Mercedes with their equipment and their careful hands, and he watched the way they moved when they found it. That particular stillness that trained men get when something confirms the worst. One of them looked up at the other. A single glance. The kind that doesn't need words because the words would be too large for the moment. Do-yun turned away from the window before they could look up at him. He had built this estate the same way he had built everything else, with precision, with paranoia, with the understanding that security was not a system but a philosophy. 12 cameras covering every approach. Motion sensors along the eastern perimeter. A rotating schedule of 8 men whose loyalty he had tested personally, in the specific and unforgiving ways that only his world offered. He had designed this compound to be a closed circuit. No signal in or out that he didn't authorize. No movement he didn't know about. No weakness he hadn't already identified and sealed. He crossed to his desk and stood behind it without sitting. The device had been placed within the last 18 hours. That was the window the technician would confirm within the hour, but Do-yun already knew it without being told, because he knew the schedule of this estate the way a surgeon knows an anatomy, every function, every access point, every hand that moved through it. 18 hours meant the device had been placed during the window between Tuesday's equipment inspection and Tuesday's departure. It meant someone with access. Someone with timing. Someone who knew the schedule well enough to find the gap between one protocol and the next. Not an outsider. He pulled open the top drawer of the desk and looked at the personnel file sitting inside, not because he needed to read it, but because he needed to feel the weight of what it represented. 15 men. Names he had chosen himself. Histories he had verified himself. Loyalties he had, in some cases, purchased and in others, genuinely believed in. He had been proud of that. Quietly, privately proud, in the way a man allows himself small satisfactions when the larger work is too heavy to celebrate. He closed the drawer. The empire he had built was not walls and cameras and rotating schedules. It was the assumption that the men inside them were his. And somewhere between that assumption and this Tuesday evening, one of them, or more than one, had looked at everything he'd given them and decided it wasn't enough to keep him alive. He had been so focused on the doors. He had never considered that the serpent was already inside the house. And the only person who had seen it coming had been the woman in the ruffled apron, the one he had walked past for 3 years without learning her name. They left the estate at midnight in a car that wasn't registered to anyone. No convoy. No flanking vehicles. No show of force that would signal to watching eyes that something had shifted. Just a single dark sedan moving through the city's quieter arteries with Do-yun in the back seat and Vesperine beside him, separated by 11 inches of leather and 3 years of silence. She had been given 20 minutes to collect her things. She had returned in 15, with a single bag that told him everything he needed to know about the kind of life she had been quietly living, the kind where you never fully unpack, because you've learned not to trust permanence. He didn't speak for the first 40 minutes of the drive. Neither did she. The safe house was in a district that didn't appear in any document connected to his name, a narrow 3-story building behind a dry goods warehouse on the city's western edge, acquired through a company that pointed to another company that pointed to a name that had been dead for 6 years. Do-yun had maintained it the way he maintained most contingencies, without sentiment, without expectation, and with the grim discipline of a man who understood that the plans you hope to never use are the only ones worth making properly. It was clean. It was stocked. The windows faced 2 directions and the back exit opened onto a lane wide enough for 1 vehicle. He showed her the rooms without ceremony. Vesperine moved through the space with a quiet, assessing attention that he recognized, not because he had ever seen it in a Maid before, but because he had seen it in survivors. The way she checked sight lines without appearing to. The way she noted exits. The way she stood in the center of the main room before she set her bag down, as though she needed to understand the geometry of the place before she could allow herself to occupy it. He filed that away. "You'll stay here until I tell you otherwise," he said. "You don't contact anyone. You don't open the door for anyone who doesn't use the word I'm about to give you." She met his eyes. "And if you don't come back?" The question landed with a weight she hadn't intended, or perhaps she had. He looked at her for a moment. "Then the person who comes will use the word anyway. And you'll know it wasn't me." It was the most honest thing he had said to another person in years. He turned to leave. He was halfway to the door when her voice reached him, not demanding, not afraid. Simply steady in the way of someone who has decided that the time for smallness is over. "You don't know my name," she said. He stopped. His back was still to her. And in the stillness of that narrow safe house, in a district that pointed to nothing and no one, Seo Do-yun, who trusted no one and forgot nothing, realized that she was right. He turned around. "Tell me," he said. Her name settled into the room like something that had always belonged there. Do-yun repeated it once, quietly, the way he repeated things he intended to keep. Then he pulled out the chair at the narrow table by the window and sat down, not at the head of it, the way he sat at every table in his own world, but at the side, which was a small thing and perhaps meant nothing. Vesperine noticed it anyway. She set her bag against the wall and sat across from him, and for the first time since the driveway, the urgency between them settled into something slower and more deliberate. The work kind of quiet. The kind that meant they were about to do something that mattered. "Tell me what you heard," he said. "From the beginning. Don't edit it." She didn't. She took him back to the East Library the way a person retraces a route they wish they'd never walked, carefully, precisely, without embellishment. She told him about the baseboard. About the shoes she had recognized before the voices. About the particular quality of their calmness, which had frightened her more than anger would have, because calm men who discuss explosives are men who have already made their peace with the decision. Do-yun listened without interrupting. She had expected questions. He gave her only attention, which was somehow more demanding. When she finished, he was still for a moment. Then, the second voice. The heavier soul. Describe him. She closed her eyes. Not for effect. Because the library lived more clearly in the dark behind her eyelids than it did in any lit room. Tall. Broader than Park Jae-won. When he crossed to the window, the floorboard near the reading table gave slightly, the one that only bends under significant weight. "I've noted which men trigger it before." She paused. "There's a scar. Left side of the jaw. I've seen it when he passes through the service corridor on inspection rounds. He holds his chin slightly elevated, the way people do when they've spent years trying to make a scar less visible by lifting it out of direct light. Do-yun's jaw tightened by a fraction. And the other forearm? She looked at him. Tattoo. Inside of the right wrist. 3 horizontal lines. I've seen it when he reaches for things on high shelves. She hesitated. He's been at the estate less than 4 months. He arrived in the second rotation after the Incheon restructuring. The name was already forming behind Do-yun's eyes. She could see it the way you see weather approaching over flat land. A darkening. A shift in pressure. He didn't say it aloud. Men like him didn't speak a name until they were certain, because certainty in his world was not a conclusion. It was a weapon. And weapons were not drawn carelessly. He stood slowly. Moved to the window. Looked at nothing in particular for a long moment. You remember all of this, he said. Not a question. Something closer to disbelief wearing the mask of a statement. I remember everything, Vesperine said quietly. That's what happens when no one thinks you're listening. It was the sound that broke it open. Not the words. Not the shoes. Not the scar or the tattoo or the weight distribution on a library floorboard. Those were pieces, useful, damning, but ultimately circumstantial in the way that Do-yun's world demanded more than circumstance before it moved. He needed something singular. Something that couldn't be explained away by proximity or coincidence or the careful maneuvering of a man who had survived long enough in this organization to know how to survive accusations. He came back to the safe house the following evening with a recorder and a name he still hadn't spoken aloud, and he sat across from Vesperine at the narrow table and asked her to go back to the pantry one more time. She had known he would ask. She had been living inside the pantry for 2 days. Before they spoke, she said, there was a sound. I registered it without understanding why at the time. The way you register something wrong in a room before you identify what's missing. She folded her hands on the table. One of them set something down on the shelf near the door. A glass. But the sound it made wasn't the flat click of glass on wood. She paused, finding the precise edge of the memory. It was a double tap. 1 click, then a half-beat pause, then a second smaller click. Like the glass touched the surface, lifted slightly, involuntarily, then settled again. Do-yun's expression didn't change. But something behind his eyes did. Park Jae-won doesn't drink during working hours, she continued. I've observed that consistently for 2 years. Whatever he carried into that room, it wasn't his. She looked directly at Do-yun. But the man with the scar, I've watched him in the dining room during the Thursday briefings when the staff serves water before the meal is cleared. Every time. Without exception. He picks up his glass, drinks, sets it down, then lifts it again almost immediately, not to drink, just to reposition it. A fraction of an inch. Like the placement unsettles him until he corrects it. His left hand. Always his left hand. The silence in the room was very complete. It's a compulsion, she said. Small enough that no one at the table would notice. But I was always at the sideboard. I noticed it the 3rd Thursday. I had noticed it every Thursday since. Do-yun placed both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, a gesture she had come to understand was not hesitation but the opposite. The final check before certainty locked into place. When he looked up, the name was already in his eyes. She could see it there, hard and cold and inevitable as a verdict. Lieutenant Kwon Tae-sung, he said. Quietly. The way a man says something he will not need to say twice. Vesperine said nothing. She had given him the sound. What he did with it now lived in a world she had only ever cleaned around, never entered, never touched. Until 6 days ago, when a library fell silent and she had been the only one listening. The invitation went out Thursday morning, the way all of Do-yun's invitations went out, not as requests, but as the kind of summons that men in his organization received with a careful neutrality on their faces and a cold calculation behind their eyes. Dinner at the estate. 8 o'clock. Attendance was not optional. It never was. By 7:50, 6 lieutenants were seated at the long dining table in the formal room where the chandelier threw amber light across the white linen and the crystal and the careful architecture of a meal designed to feel like an ordinary thing. Do-yun sat at the head in a charcoal suit, unhurried, pouring his own water with the particular ease of a man who has already decided how the evening ends. He was pleasant in the way that deep water is pleasant, smooth on the surface, and no indication of what it holds below. Vesperine came in from the service door at 8:15. She had been given a pressed uniform, a silver tea service, and a single instruction from Do-yun delivered that afternoon in a voice stripped of everything except precision. Move through the room. Pour. Listen. Do not look at anyone longer than the service requires. And trust that I am watching. She had nodded once. She had not told him that her hands were steady. She had not needed to. He had looked at her in the way he was learning to look at her, as someone whose steadiness was not a performance but a practice, built over years of being unprotected and choosing presence anyway. She pushed through the service door and the room received her the way it always had. As furniture. She moved to the sideboard first. Arranged the cups. Lifted the pot. The room's conversation continued around her like water around stone, talk of logistics, of the upcoming summit, of a rival organization's restructuring in the north. Normal sounds. Controlled sounds. The sounds of men who did not know the evening had already been designed around them. She reached Lieutenant Park Jae-won first. Poured without incident. Moved left. When she reached Kwon Tae-sung, she did not allow herself a single extra breath. He was broad-shouldered and sharp-jawed, the scar on the left side of his face catching the amber light in a way that confirmed every detail she had carried in her memory for 6 days. She set the cup. Lifted the pot. Poured. His eyes moved over her the way powerful men's eyes move over service staff, without landing, without registering, already gone to the next thing. She was halfway back to the sideboard when she heard it. The double tap. One click. A half-beat pause. A second smaller click. His left hand. Repositioning the cup he had not yet drunk from. She set the pot down on the sideboard and kept her back to the room and breathed once, slowly, all the way down. Across the table, without looking up from his glass, Do-yun's jaw moved almost imperceptibly. He had heard it too. The dinner ended the way Do-yun ended most things, on his terms, at a time of his choosing, with the room never quite understanding what had just happened inside it. The lieutenants were guided from the dining room to the adjacent study under the pretense of reviewing summit logistics. A routine debriefing. The kind that happened often enough that no one questioned the movement, the closed door, the fact that Do-yun's two most trusted remaining men had positioned themselves with their backs to the walls before anyone had taken their seat. Kwon Tae-sung sat in the third chair from the left. He crossed one leg over the other with the ease of a man who had attended 100 meetings in this room and expected to attend 100 more. Do-yun stood at the far end, beside the long credenza, and said nothing for a moment. He let the silence do its preliminary work. Then he reached down and pressed play on the recorder sitting on the credenza's surface. The sound that came out was small. Domestic. Entirely unremarkable to every person in the room except one. A double tap, one click, a half-beat pause, a second smaller click, recorded 3 days earlier in the safe house when Vesperine had demonstrated it against the table surface at Do-yun's request. Followed immediately by her voice, clear and unhurried in the recording. He picks up the glass, sets it down, then lifts it again to reposition. His left hand. Always his left hand. Every Thursday without exception. The room was very still. Do-yun let the recording run 4 more seconds before he stopped it. He didn't look at Kwon Tae-sung immediately. He looked at the recorder, as though giving the men a final courtesy of preparation. Then he looked up. Kwon's face had not collapsed. He was too experienced for that. But something behind it had, the invisible scaffolding that holds a performance together had shifted, and the shift was visible to anyone who knew how to look. His left hand, resting on his knee, had gone completely motionless. The compulsion suppressed for the first time, which was its own kind of confession. The device was mercury-tilt, Do-yun said, conversationally. Rear axle. Placed during the 18-hour window between Tuesday's inspection and departure. He tilted his head slightly. You ran vehicle logistics for that window through Park Jae-won, who I suspect believed he was facilitating a routine equipment check. A man who follows orders without questions is useful to someone who needs clean hands. He paused. You have very clean hands, Tae-sung. The room waited. Kwon Tae-sung looked at Do-yun for a long moment with something that might, in another life, have been respect. Then he laughed, a short, dry sound with no warmth in it. "A maid," he said. "Yes," Do-yun said simply. It was the most expensive word Kwon Tae-sung had ever heard spoken. Kwon Tae-sung did not leave the estate that night. Neither did the men with the heavier soul, a logistics coordinator named Baek Sung-min who had been with the organization for 3 months and 11 days and who, when Do-yun's men walked him out of the staff quarters at midnight, had the particular expression of someone who had known this moment was coming and had simply miscalculated when. There was no scene. There was no noise. That was the nature of Do-yun's world. Consequences arrived the way the best plans did, quietly and completely, leaving no surface disturbed. Park Jae-won was a different matter. He had wept, which Do-yun had not expected, and the weeping had confirmed what he had already assessed, that Jae-won was a man who had been used rather than recruited, leveraged through a debt that Kwon had identified and applied with surgical precision. Do-yun had looked at him for a long time across the study table. Then he had told him to go home. Jae-won had not understood immediately. Then he had. The relief on his face was so enormous it was almost painful to witness, and Do-yun had looked away because there were things he was still learning to let himself see. The restructuring took 4 days. He filled the positions with men he had vetted through an entirely new protocol, one that had been quietly designed with input he had not originally planned to seek. Vesperine had said it simply, the evening he brought her back to the estate. The gap wasn't in your cameras or your schedules. It was in who you allowed to move through unobserved. He had listened. He had implemented. He did not announce where the idea had come from, but he remembered. On the 5th morning, the black Mercedes was gone. Replaced. Do-yun stood in the driveway at 7:15 in the early light, in a charcoal suit with the collar open by one button, a detail so minor that no one on his staff had ever seen it before and no one remarked on it now. He stood beside the new car with the door open. Not waiting. Waiting was passive. He was simply present. In the deliberate way he was learning to be present in spaces he had previously only occupied. Vesperine came through the front door at 7:17. Not the service entrance. The front door. She had hesitated at it briefly, the habit of 3 years pressing against the newness of this, and then she had come through it with the quiet, grounded composure of a woman who had decided to stop moving around the edges of her own life. She crossed the cobblestone. Stopped at the car. Looked at the open door, then at him. Do-yun said nothing. There was nothing that required saying. He had spent years filling rooms with authority and silence. This was the first time the silence had felt like an opening rather than a wall. She got in. He closed the door behind her, carefully, completely, and walked around to his side. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Seo Do-yun drove away from his estate without checking the mirrors. There is a kind of intelligence that never appears on a resume. It doesn't carry a title or sit at the head of a table. It doesn't speak in boardrooms or sign its name to decisions that move money across borders. It lives in the margins of powerful spaces, in the service corridors and the pantries and the east libraries where the baseboards collect dust in carved grooves that no one checks but everyone would notice if neglected. It belongs to the people who arrive before the room fills and leave after it empties. The people who learn, out of pure necessity, to read the temperature of a space the way a sailor reads weather, not from instruments, but from long and quiet attention. Seo Do-yun had built an empire on the assumption that power flowed downward. That intelligence was a function of rank. That the higher the position, the sharper the vision. It was a reasonable assumption. It was also the assumption that had nearly killed him. What saved him was the opposite. There is something that the most fortified organizations in the world have in common with the most vulnerable ones. They are all, at their core, collections of human beings moving through shared space. And in that shared space, information does not distribute itself according to hierarchy. It distributes itself according to presence. The person who is always in the room accumulates the truth of the room, regardless of whether they are invited to speak it. The assistant who refills the water glasses during the quarterly meeting hears more of what is real than the consultant who presents for 40 minutes and leaves. The janitor who works the late shift knows which offices run dark at midnight and which ones don't. The maid who cleans the East Library every morning knows which floorboards bend under significant weight. The tragedy is not that this intelligence exists. It has always existed. The tragedy is that it goes unused, not because it is unreliable, but because the people who hold it have learned, through long experience, that no one in power is listening. That speaking costs more than it returns. That the safest version of themselves is the invisible one. Vesperine had known what she knew for years before she ran into that driveway. The question was never whether she saw. The question was whether the world she worked inside had ever made it safe enough to say so. True leadership is not the ability to make people afraid. Fear produces compliance. It does not produce truth. And an organization built on fear will always be exactly as blind as its most frightened member, which is to say, profoundly, dangerously blind at the very moments that matter most. The real architecture of safety is not cameras or protocols or rotating schedules. It is the culture of a room. Whether the smallest hands in it believe, genuinely believe, that what they carry is worth bringing forward. Do-yun learned this the hard way. Most do. The fortunate ones learn it before the red light stops blinking.